The phone rang at 4 in the morning, and Dorian Vane knew before he even answered it that something was wrong. Nobody called him at that hour unless the house was on fire or his daughter was missing. It was the second one. Grace, the head of his household staff, was already crying before she finished the first sentence. Lily was gone. Her bed was empty. The side door near the garden was open, and nobody had seen her leave. Dorian was out of bed and dressed in under 2 minutes. He did not shout. He did not throw anything. Men who worked for him for years said that was the most frightening thing about him, that he became calmer, not louder, when something threatened to break him. He walked down the stairs of his large stone house with his shoes still untied and his shirt half buttoned, and by the time he reached the front hall, 7 men were already waiting for him, each one holding a radio, each one refusing to meet his eyes. Victor Lang, his oldest friend, and the man who ran his security, met him at the door. Victor had known Dorian since they were teenagers running errands for other men, long before either of them had any real power. Victor had also known Lily since the day she was born. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. "We have people checking every street within 2 miles, he said. "Cameras are being pulled from every shop and every crossing. She could not have gone far. She is 7 years old, Dorian. She could not have gone far." Dorian did not answer. He walked past Victor and out into the cold morning air, and for a moment he stood on the stone steps of his own home and felt something he had not felt in years, something close to fear. He had built a life where fear belonged to other people. Men who crossed him were afraid. Men who owed him money were afraid. He had spent 15 years making sure that fear never touched his own family, and now it was standing right in front of him, wearing his daughter's face. They searched for 3 hours. Every street, every park, every shop that opened early. Dorian rode in the back of a car with the window down, scanning every doorway, every bench, every small shape that could have been a little girl in a yellow coat. He thought of every enemy he had ever made. He thought of every threat that had ever been whispered against his family. His mind built terrible pictures, one after another, and he forced himself to breathe through each one and keep looking. It was Victor who found her, or rather, it was Victor who received the call from one of his men, a young driver named Oliver, who had been sent to check the row of small shops near the old market square. Oliver's voice came through the radio, sounding confused rather than alarmed. "Sir," he said, "I found her. She is sitting outside a bakery. She is fine. She is eating something." Dorian's car reached the market square in under 4 minutes. He stepped out before the driver had even brought it to a full stop, and there, exactly as Oliver had said, was his daughter. Lily was sitting on a wooden bench outside a small bakery with a faded green sign, her legs swinging because they did not reach the ground, a paper bag in her lap, talking with complete comfort to a young woman who was kneeling in front of her, listening to every word as though it mattered more than anything else in the world. Dorian's fear turned into something else almost instantly, something sharp and unfamiliar, because this woman was a stranger. He did not know her face. He did not know her name. He did not know how his daughter had found her way to this exact bench, in this exact street, at 5 in the morning, and he did not know why Lily looked more peaceful in that moment than she had looked in months. "Lily," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. She turned and saw him, and her face did not show fear or guilt, the way a child caught doing something wrong usually looks. Instead, she smiled, a small, tired, satisfied smile, and said, "Dad, this is Noemi. She gave me a cinnamon roll." The young woman rose to her feet slowly. She was tall, with dark curling hair pulled back loosely, wearing an apron dusted with flour, even though the shop behind her was clearly not yet open for the day. She did not look frightened of the group of serious men now standing around the small square, which surprised Dorian more than anything else that morning. Most people who saw Victor and the others arrive in dark cars at that hour understood, without being told, that something important and possibly dangerous was happening. This woman simply looked concerned for the child in front of her and mildly annoyed at the disruption. "Is this her father?" she asked Lily directly, not Dorian. "Yes," Lily said. "He worries a lot." Noemi looked up at Dorian then, and there was no fear in her eyes, only a steady, evaluating calm, the kind of look a teacher gives a parent who has arrived late to collect a child from school. She said she couldn't sleep, Noemi told him. She said her house was too quiet. I was opening the ovens early to start the morning bread, and she was just sitting outside the door when I unlocked it. I gave her something warm and let her stay until you could be reached. I did not have a way to call anyone. She would not tell me a phone number. Dorian crouched down until he was at eye level with his daughter. Up close, he could see that she had been crying earlier, the faint redness still around her eyes, though she was calm now, calmer than he had seen her in a long time. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to scold her for leaving the house alone, for frightening him, for making him imagine the worst things a man in his position could imagine. But looking at her small face, still soft with sleep, he found he could not do it. "Why did you leave the house?" he asked quietly. Lily looked down at the paper bag in her hands. "I wanted to see if anyone would notice," she said. "And then I got hungry, and the bakery smelled like Mom used to smell, when she made bread on Sundays." The words hit Dorian harder than any threat ever had. He had known, in some distant way, that his daughter was struggling since her mother's passing months earlier, but he had been so consumed by holding his world together, by making sure no one saw weakness in him, that he had not truly stopped to see how alone his own child had become inside the walls of their enormous house. Nannies came and left. Staff members were kind, but distant, careful, professional. Nobody in that house made bread on Sundays anymore. Nobody filled it with warm smells and soft sounds. It had become a beautiful, silent, empty place, and his daughter had walked out into the dark to find some small piece of what she had lost. He looked up at Noemi, this stranger who had, without knowing anything about who he was or what his life contained, simply opened her door to a frightened child and given her warmth and patience until her family could be found. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt unfamiliar in his mouth, because he did not often thank people, and he almost never meant it as much as he meant it in that moment. "It was nothing," Noemi said, brushing flour from her apron. Anyone would have done the same. Dorian doubted that very much, though he did not say so. He had learned long ago that very few people did the right thing simply because it was right, without calculating what they might gain from it. He studied her face for a moment, searching for the calculation he was used to seeing in people who discovered, even briefly, that they had something a powerful man wanted. He found none. She looked tired, a little irritated at the early hour, and genuinely fond of the small girl beside her, and nothing more than that. He stood and lifted Lily into his arms, though she was nearly too big now to be carried easily, and she rested her head against his shoulder, the way she used to when she was much smaller. Over her shoulder, he looked back once more at the bakery, at its faded sign that read, "Hearts, Bread and Sweets," and at the young woman standing in the doorway watching them go, her arms crossed loosely against the morning chill. That should have been the end of it. A frightened father, a missing child found safe, a kind stranger thanked and forgotten, the way such moments usually faded once the danger had passed. Dorian told himself, on the ride home, that this was exactly what it would become, a strange story he would tell no one, a small crack in an otherwise ordinary morning. But Lily did not forget the bakery, and within 3 days, she had found her way back there twice more, each time slipping past guards who had never before failed to notice a 7-year-old child leaving a heavily watched estate. Dorian increased security around the house. He spoke to every member of staff. He questioned Lily gently but firmly about why she kept returning to a stranger's shop when she had everything she could possibly need at home. Her answer, each time, was the same, delivered with the plain honesty that only children seem capable of. "Because Noemi listens," she said. "She doesn't look at me like I'm something breakable. She just lets me talk." Dorian sat with that answer for a long time after Lily had gone to bed on the 3rd night. He thought about all the people in his life who spoke to him carefully, who chose their words around him the way a person chooses their steps across thin ice, always aware of what he was, always aware of what he could do if displeased. He wondered, with a discomfort he did not enjoy, whether his own daughter had begun to feel the same careful distance from everyone around her, even from him. The next morning, without telling anyone where he was going, he drove to the small bakery himself. The shop was busier now, mid-morning light falling through its windows onto shelves of bread and pastries, a handful of customers moving between the counter and the door. Noemi was behind the register, her sleeves pushed up, flour still faintly dusting one cheek, laughing at something an older customer had said. When she noticed Dorian standing near the entrance, her expression shifted into something more guarded, though not frightened. "Mr. Vane," she said, using the name Lily must have told her, or perhaps a name she had learned elsewhere, since a man like Dorian was not entirely unknown in the wider city. "Is Lily all right?" "She is fine," Dorian said. He glanced around the small shop, at its warm colors and its handwritten signs, at the way sunlight caught the dust in the air near the window. "I came to talk to you, if you have a few minutes." Noemi studied him for a long moment, then called toward the back room for someone named Ivy to take over the counter, and led him to a small table near the window, away from the other customers. She did not offer him anything to eat or drink, and she did not seem interested in impressing him, which he found, once again, oddly refreshing. "I want to understand why my daughter keeps coming here," he said, once they were seated. "And I want to understand what you want from this." Noemi's eyebrows rose slightly. "What I want," she repeated. "People do not usually help a stranger's child without wanting something eventually," Dorian said. "Money, favor, protection, something." For a moment, Noemi looked as though she might simply stand up and walk away, and something in Dorian almost hoped she would, because it would confirm what he expected of most people who entered his orbit. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair and studied him with open curiosity, as though he were a puzzle she had not expected to find interesting. "I do not know who you are, exactly," she said carefully, "though I have heard your name spoken with a certain tone by people in this neighborhood, the kind of tone people use when they are afraid of someone. I am not afraid of you, Mr. Vane. I do not have anything you would want, and I do not want anything you have. Your daughter showed up outside my shop, cold and hungry, and clearly carrying something heavy for someone her age. I fed her. I listened to her. That is all this is." Dorian said nothing for a moment, turning her words over, searching again for the trick, the angle, the hidden motive he had trained himself to find in every interaction. He found nothing but plain, unguarded honesty, delivered without hesitation, and without any attempt to soften it for his benefit. "Her mother passed away 8 months ago," he said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth, since he rarely spoke of it to anyone. "Lily has not been the same since. I have tried everything I know to help her. Doctors, toys, trips. Nothing has worked the way that seems to have worked, in just a handful of visits to this shop." Something in Noemi's expression softened, the guarded edge falling away entirely. "I am sorry," she said, and it did not sound like the empty sympathy people usually offered him, the kind meant only to be polite. It sounded like she meant it completely. "Grief does not need doctors or toys," she added after a moment. "Sometimes it just needs someone who is not afraid to sit with it. I lost my own mother when I was young. I know what it feels like to walk into a room full of people who love you, and still feel entirely alone." Dorian looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since his wife's funeral, he felt understood by someone who was not simply trying to manage him, or please him, or extract something from him. It unsettled him more than any threat he had faced in years, this sudden, unfamiliar sense of being truly seen. "I do not know what to ask of you," he admitted. "I do not want to disrupt your life, but I also do not want to take away the one thing that seems to be helping my daughter." Noemi considered this for a moment, glancing toward the window, toward the street outside where the ordinary world continued moving, unaware of the strange, careful conversation happening inside the small bakery. "Let her come," she said finally, "not sneaking out in the dark, frightening you half to death. Bring her, properly, when it suits you both. I will not charge you for cinnamon rolls, Mr. Vane, but I will insist that she stop climbing out of windows to get them." Despite everything weighing on him, despite the exhaustion of the past 3 sleepless nights, Dorian felt the corner of his mouth lift, unexpectedly, into something close to a smile. "That," he said, standing and extending his hand toward her, "I can agree to." Noemi shook his hand firmly, without hesitation, without the practiced caution most people showed him, and in that simple, ordinary gesture, something quietly and permanently shifted, though neither of them yet understood how far that shift would eventually carry them. Walking back to his car a few minutes later, Dorian glanced once more at the small shop with its faded green sign. at the warm light spilling from its windows onto the street, and felt, for the first time in 8 long months, something that was not quite hope, but stood very close to it. The bell over the bakery door rang for the 5th time that morning, and Noemi Hart did not even need to look up to know who it was. She had learned, in the space of only a few weeks, to recognize the particular rhythm of Lily's footsteps, quick and light, followed a moment later by the heavier, more measured steps of whichever guard had been assigned to walk her there that day. "Good morning," Noemi called from behind the counter, already reaching for a small plate. Lily climbed onto her usual stool at the end of the counter, dropping her school bag onto the floor beside her feet, and gave a long, dramatic sigh, the kind only a child can produce over a problem that adults would consider very small. "Bad day?" Noemi asked, sliding the plate toward her. "Terrible," Lily said. Ellie Simmons said her mother packed her a heart-shaped sandwich for lunch, and everyone thought it was wonderful, and I didn't say anything, but I wanted to. Noemi tilted her head, considering this with the same seriousness she gave every problem Lily brought her, whether it was a lost toy or a difficult arithmetic lesson, or, as it increasingly was these days, something quieter and heavier underneath the surface. "Would you like a heart-shaped sandwich tomorrow?" she asked. Lily's face brightened instantly. "You would do that?" "Of course I would do that," Noemi said. "I have a heart-shaped cutter somewhere in the back. It is usually for biscuits, but I do not see why it could not work for sandwiches as well." It was such a small thing, and yet Noemi had come to understand, over the past weeks, that these small things were exactly what Lily needed most. Not grand gestures, not expensive gifts, but the steady, ordinary attention of someone who noticed the details of her days and treated them as though they mattered. What Noemi had not expected, when she agreed to let Lily visit properly instead of sneaking out in the early hours, was how quickly the girl would become a genuine part of her daily rhythm, or how much she herself would come to look forward to the sound of that bell ringing in the middle of each afternoon. She had grown up an only child herself, raised largely by an aunt after losing her own parents young, and there was something in Lily's quiet, careful watchfulness that reminded Noemi powerfully of herself at that age, of the particular loneliness of a child who has learned too early that the world can take things away without warning. Over the following weeks, their routine deepened. Lily began arriving not just in the afternoons but on weekend mornings as well, tying on a small apron that Noemi had found for her in a shop 2 streets over, standing on a low wooden step stool to reach the counter, learning to measure flour and crack eggs, and fold dough with hands that were slowly growing more confident with each visit. "You are getting good at this," Noemi told her one Saturday morning, watching Lily carefully press her thumb into a ball of dough to check whether it had risen properly, exactly as she had been taught. "My mom used to bake," Lily said, not looking up. "On Sundays. The whole house would smell like bread." It was the first time she had spoken about her mother so directly, without being asked, and Noemi kept her hands moving, kept her voice light and easy, careful not to make the moment feel too large or too fragile, the way she had learned children needed such moments handled. "That sounds lovely," she said simply. "She used to let me help," Lily continued, "but then she got sick, and she couldn't stand for very long anymore, so I would sit on the stool and she would sit in a chair next to me and tell me what to do, and then she couldn't do that either. And then she was just gone." Noemi set down the bowl she was holding and knelt beside the small stool, bringing herself level with the girl's face. "I am so glad you told me that," she said gently. "It means a great deal that you would share her with me like that." Lily looked at her for a long moment, her small face working through something complicated, and then, unexpectedly, she reached out and hugged Noemi tightly around the neck, the way children do when words run out but feeling does not. Noemi held her without hesitation, feeling something in her own chest tighten and loosen at the same time, and it was in that exact moment, with flour on both their hands and warm bread rising in the oven behind them, that a passing figure paused outside the shop window and watched. Dorian had not planned to stop that morning. He had been driving past on his way to a meeting across the city, dressed in a dark, tailored coat, entirely out of place among the market stalls and small shops of that street, and something had made him glance toward the bakery window out of habit, the way he now often did when passing that particular corner. What he saw through the glass stopped him completely. His daughter, laughing, flower on her nose, wrapped in the arms of a young woman who was clearly holding her with the same fierce gentleness a mother might. It was such a simple scene, and yet Dorian found himself standing on the pavement outside, unable to move, watching his daughter be happy, in a way he had not managed to make happen himself in 8 long months of trying. He entered the shop a moment later, the bell announcing him, and both Lily and Noemi looked up, both faces shifting instantly into welcome. "Dad," Lily said, wiping her hands quickly on her apron, before running over to show him the shape of dough she had folded. "Look what I made." "That is very good," he said, crouching to examine it properly, though his eyes kept drifting toward Noemi over his daughter's head. Noemi rose from the floor, brushing flour from her knees, and offered him the same steady, unguarded look she always did, without the careful performance he was accustomed to seeing on the faces of people who knew who he was. "She is a natural," Noemi said. "Better hands than most adults I have taught." Dorian found himself lingering in the shop longer than he had intended, watching the two of them return to their work at the counter, listening to their easy conversation, the small jokes between them, the patient way Noemi corrected Lily's technique without ever making her feel foolish. He told himself he stayed because it was good for Lily to see her father approve of this new friendship. He did not yet let himself examine the other reasons that kept his feet planted on that spot longer than any meeting ever required. It became, in the weeks that followed, a habit he did not fully admit to himself. A meeting nearby that could be rearranged to pass the bakery afterward. A drive home that took the longer route through that particular street. A reason, always some small reason, to step through that door and spend 20 minutes in a warm, ordinary room that smelled of bread and sugar, where nobody looked at him with fear or calculation, where his daughter's laughter came easily and often. Victor noticed first, as Victor noticed most things. "You have been to that bakery 6 times this month," he said one evening, as the two of them reviewed reports in Dorian's study, the way they did most nights. "I am not questioning it. I am simply noting it." "It is good for Lily," Dorian said, without looking up from the papers in front of him. "It is good for you as well," Victor said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only the quiet observation of a friend who had known him for over 20 years. "I have not seen you laugh the way you laughed last week, standing outside that window, watching her decorate biscuits, in longer than I can remember." Dorian did not answer, because he did not know how to answer honestly, without admitting something he was not yet ready to name, even to himself. He had built his entire adult life around control, around never allowing himself to want something he could not simply take or command, and the quiet, patient pull he felt toward that small bakery, and toward the woman who ran it, did not follow any of the rules he had spent years mastering. Word of his visit spread slowly through the tighter circles of his organization, the way such things always eventually did. Not in loud whispers, not yet, but in the careful, sideways glances of men who had known Dorian Vane only as a controlled, unreadable figure, and who now noticed the small, unfamiliar softness that had entered his manner. Some found it strange, a few found it concerning. A man in his position, they murmured quietly among themselves, could not afford to be seen with weakness, and to many of them, tenderness and weakness were the same thing. Noemi, for her part, remained largely unaware of how closely her small, ordinary life was being watched by people far outside her usual world. She continued running her shop, continued teaching Lily to bake on weekend mornings, continued treating Dorian, when he visited, with the same plain, unimpressed honesty she had shown him from their very first conversation. She did not soften her manner around him the way most people did once they learned who he was. She still told him, without hesitation, when she thought he was working too much, or when he looked tired, or when he had clearly not eaten a proper meal that day. "You know," she said to him one evening, as he waited for Lily to finish washing flour from her hands in the small back sink, "most people are careful with me, once they know what I am. You are not careful with me at all." "Should I be?" Noemi asked, raising an eyebrow, not looking up from the tray of pastries she was arranging. "I do not know," Dorian admitted, and it was one of the most honest things he had said to another adult in years. "Most people find a reason to be." Noemi finally looked up at him then, studying his face with the same open curiosity she had shown him from the beginning, as though he were still, after all these weeks, a puzzle she found genuinely interesting to work through. "I do not care what you are, Mr. Vane," she said simply. "I care what you are to Lily. And lately, I care rather more than I expected to, about what kind of man stands here every evening, tired, still in his coat, watching his daughter learn to bake bread as though it were the most important thing in the world." Dorian did not have an answer for that, not one he trusted himself to say aloud, and so he said nothing, only watched her return to her work with the same steady, unbothered focus she brought to everything, while something inside his carefully guarded chest continued, quietly and without his full permission, to shift further out of place. That night, driving home with Lily asleep against the car window beside him, flour still faintly dusting the front of her jacket, Dorian found himself thinking not of the meetings waiting for him the next morning, nor of the rivals circling the edges of his territory, nor of any of the usual weights that occupied his mind. He found himself thinking only of a small shop with a faded green sign, and the woman inside it who had, without ever intending to, become something he was no longer entirely sure he could walk away from. He did not yet know how much danger that quiet, ordinary happiness would soon place her in, nor how quickly the walls he had built around his family would be tested by the very softness he had allowed himself to feel. For now, driving through the dark streets with his daughter sleeping peacefully beside him, he allowed himself simply to feel it, unguarded, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The first sign of trouble arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, in the shape of a delivery truck that never should have stopped outside the bakery at all. Noemi noticed it first, because it idled too long at the curb, its engine running well past the time any normal delivery required, and because the two men inside it did not once look toward the shop, the careful, deliberate kind of not looking that people do when they are trying very hard to seem uninterested in something. She mentioned it to Ivy, her shop assistant, in passing, the way a person mentions something odd without yet understanding its full weight, and then the truck pulled away, and the moment passed, and the afternoon continued as it always did. She did not think of it again until 3 days later, when a man she did not recognize walked into the shop just before closing, ordered nothing, and instead asked a series of careful, pointed questions about her hours, about who else worked there, about whether a young girl in a yellow coat visited often. Noemi answered him politely at first, out of simple habit, before something in his manner, too smooth, too rehearsed, made the fine hairs along her arms rise with a sudden, instinctive unease. "I think you should leave now," she told him, her voice steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest, and the man had smiled, an unpleasant, knowing smile, and left without another word. She told Dorian about it that same evening, when he arrived to collect Lily, and watched his expression change the moment she finished describing the man's questions. The warmth that usually softened his face around her and Lily vanished entirely, replaced by something cold and focused, a stillness she had not seen in him before, and it frightened her far more than the strange man's questions had. "Describe him exactly," Dorian said, his voice low and controlled in a way that made Noemi understand, in that instant, how far his calm could stretch even under real strain. She described him as best she could, and Dorian listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, before he excused himself briefly to make a call outside the shop. Through the window, Noemi watched him speak into his phone with sharp, clipped words, watched Victor's car arrive within minutes, watched the two men speak quietly on the pavement, while Lily, oblivious, continued arranging biscuits into careful rows on the counter inside. "I want extra people watching this street," she heard Dorian say, before he stepped back inside, his expression carefully smoothed over again for his daughter's benefit, though Noemi could see the strain still tightening the corners of his eyes. "Is everything all right?" Lily asked, glancing up from her biscuits. "Everything is fine," Dorian told her, crouching to kiss the top of her head. "I am simply making sure everyone stays safe." That night, after Lily had gone home with Dorian, Noemi sat alone in her small apartment above the shop, unable to shake the unsettled feeling that had followed her all evening. She told herself it was nothing, that the man had likely been confused, mistaken, harmless, in some ordinary way she simply had not understood. But the memory of Dorian's face, the sudden coldness that had replaced his usual warmth, told her a different story, one she was not yet ready to fully examine. 2 days later, the trouble found her directly. It happened just after closing, the shop empty, the front door already locked, Noemi moving through her usual routine of wiping down counters and covering the last trays of bread for the night. She heard the back door rattle once, sharply, and assumed at first it was simply the wind, or Ivy returning for something forgotten, until it rattled again, harder, followed by the unmistakable sound of the lock beginning to give way beneath deliberate pressure. Her heart began pounding immediately, a cold, sharp fear unlike anything she had felt before, and she reached instinctively for her phone, her fingers clumsy with panic, as she dialed the only number that came to mind. Dorian answered on the second ring, and the moment she spoke, her voice shaking, telling him someone was trying to force their way into the back of the shop. His tone shifted instantly into something sharp and commanding, entirely unlike anything she had heard from him before. "Get to the front of the shop," he said. "Stay on the phone with me. Do not go near the back door. I am sending people to you right now, and I am coming myself." Noemi did exactly as he said, moving quickly toward the front of the shop, her back pressed against the counter, her eyes fixed on the shadowed shapes moving faintly behind the frosted glass of the back door. The pressure against the lock continued for what felt like an unbearably long stretch of time, though in truth, it could only have been a few minutes, before the sound of screeching tires and slamming car doors erupted outside, followed almost immediately by silence. By the time Dorian burst through the front door moments later, his coat half open, his usually composed face stripped entirely of its calm, the back door stood undisturbed, the would-be intruders having fled the moment Victor's men arrived on the street. Noemi was still standing exactly where she had been told to stand, trembling, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand, and the instant Dorian saw her, unharmed but visibly shaken, something in his expression broke open in a way she had never witnessed before. He crossed the shop in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms without hesitation, without any of the careful distance he usually kept, and Noemi found herself gripping the front of his coat tightly, her breath coming in short, uneven pulls, as the adrenaline of the past several minutes finally began to release its hold on her. "I am so sorry," he said quietly into her hair, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like guilt. "This is my fault. I should have told you the moment I suspected there was any danger at all." "What is happening?" Noemi asked, pulling back just enough to look at him properly, her eyes searching his face for the answers he had never fully given her. "Who were those men, and why would anyone want to hurt me?" Dorian was quiet for a long moment, his hands still resting steady on her shoulders, before he finally spoke the truth he had been avoiding since the very first morning he had found his daughter sitting outside this exact shop. "The world I come from is not a safe one," he said carefully. "I have enemies, men who have wanted to hurt me for a very long time, and they have learned that you and Lily matter to me. That makes you a target, whether either of us wanted that or not." Noemi absorbed this slowly, the pieces of the past several weeks rearranging themselves in her mind, the careful men who had always accompanied Lily, the sudden tension whenever certain topics arose, the way Dorian's calm sometimes cracked just slightly when he thought no one was watching closely enough to notice. "I knew you were dangerous," she said finally, her voice steadier now, though still faintly shaking. "I did not fully understand what that meant until tonight." "I understand if this changes things," Dorian said, and there was something raw and unguarded in his voice, an honesty he rarely allowed himself. "I understand if you want us to stay away, for your own safety. I would not blame you for that." Noemi looked at him for a long moment, considering the fear still coursing through her body, the memory of that door rattling under deliberate pressure, the terrifying uncertainty of those few endless minutes alone in her shop. And then she thought of Lily's small hands carefully folding dough, of her laughter echoing through the shop on quiet afternoons, of the steady warmth that had grown between the 3 of them over these past weeks, warmth she had not realized how deeply she had come to depend on, until the thought of losing it settled cold and heavy in her chest. "I am frightened," she admitted honestly, "but I am not leaving, not because of one bad night, and not because of men who did not even have the courage to face me directly." Dorian studied her with something close to disbelief, as though he had expected her fear to outweigh whatever had grown between them, as though he had braced himself for her to walk away the moment the true weight of his world became visible to her. Instead, she stood in front of him, still shaking but resolute, refusing to be pushed out of a life that had, without either of them fully planning it, become entwined with his own. "Then I will make certain nothing like this happens again," he said quietly, and the promise carried a weight that Noemi understood, even then, extended far beyond ordinary reassurance. In the days that followed, Dorian's protection around the bakery increased dramatically, careful and unobtrusive but unmistakably present, men positioned at either end of the street, cameras installed discreetly around the shop's exterior, a quiet but constant vigilance that Noemi noticed but chose not to question too closely. She continued her days largely as before, opening the shop each morning, teaching Lily on the weekends, though a new awareness now colored every ordinary moment, a knowledge that the warmth she had built here existed alongside real and present danger. Dorian, for his part, began appearing at the shop more openly than before, no longer disguising his visits as convenient detours or passing errands. He came directly, deliberately, staying longer, speaking more freely, allowing Noemi and Lily both to see more of the man beneath the careful control he showed the rest of the world. Something had shifted permanently after that frightening night, a wall that had quietly come down between them, replaced by a closeness neither of them fully named, but both clearly felt. Victor watched this transformation with a mixture of concern and something close to relief. He worried, as any careful man in his position would, about the vulnerability this closeness created, about the ways Dorian's enemies might continue to exploit the softness that had entered his old friend's life. But he also saw, more clearly than he had in years, the return of something in Dorian he had feared was lost forever after his wife's passing. A genuine, unguarded warmth that no amount of power or control had ever managed to provide him. "You are happier," Victor said simply, one evening, watching Dorian help Lily carry a tray of biscuits out to the car after another long afternoon at the bakery. "I am frightened," Dorian admitted quietly, watching his daughter laugh at something Noemi had said. "I have not felt this frightened of losing something in a very long time. But yes, Victor, I am happier than I have been in years." The danger had not passed, not truly, and both men understood that clearly enough. But standing there, watching Lily and Noemi together in the fading evening light, Dorian found himself unwilling to retreat from what had grown between them, no matter what risks it carried. Whatever storm was still building on the horizon, he had already decided, quietly and completely, that he would face it standing beside them rather than apart. The name that kept surfacing in Victor's reports over the following weeks belonged to a man called Edward Voss, a rival with old grievances against Dorian's family and a long history of testing weaknesses before striking directly. Victor laid the information out carefully one evening in Dorian's study. Photographs and notes spread across the wide desk between them, and Dorian studied each piece in silence, his expression unreadable. "He has been asking questions about the bakery for weeks," Victor said. "Suppliers, delivery schedules, the woman's daily routine." This was not a random attempt the other night. It was a message. "What kind of message?" Dorian asked, though he already suspected the answer. "That he knows exactly where to find the people you care about," Victor said grimly, "and that he is willing to use them against you, if you give him reason to believe it will work." Dorian sat with that knowledge for a long time after Victor left, staring at the photographs scattered across his desk, at grainy images of Noemi walking home from the shop, of Lily climbing out of the car outside the bakery, ordinary moments captured and studied by people who meant them harm. He had spent years building walls thick enough to keep his family safe from exactly this kind of threat, and now, through no fault of anyone but his own unguarded heart, those walls had developed a crack wide enough for danger to slip through. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat awake, turning over every possible choice available to him, weighing the cold, familiar logic that had guided him through every difficult decision of his adult life against something newer and far less familiar, a reluctance to simply retreat from the two people who had brought warmth back into his world. The following morning, he went to the bakery, earlier than usual, before it had even opened for the day, and found Noemi already at work behind the counter, flour dusting her hands as she shaped the morning's first loaves. She looked up when the bell rang, surprised to see him so early, and her expression shifted quickly when she registered the tension written plainly across his face. "What is it?" she asked, setting down the dough immediately. Dorian told her everything then, holding nothing back. The identity of the man behind the recent threats, the long history of rivalry that had led to this moment, the very real possibility that her continued presence in his life placed her in genuine, ongoing danger. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, searching for the fear he expected, the retreat he had braced himself to accept if it came. Instead, Noemi listened with steady, careful attention, her jaw set, her eyes never leaving his face, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "You are trying to give me a way out," she said finally. "You are laying all of this in front of me so that I will decide it is too much, and step away, and you will not have to be the one who asks me to." Dorian did not deny it, because there was no point pretending otherwise, not to a woman who had never allowed him to hide anything from her since the very first morning they met. "I do not want you hurt because of me," he said honestly. "I have already lost one person I love. I do not know if I could survive losing another." Something in Noemi's expression softened at those words, at the raw admission buried inside them, though her resolve did not waver. She crossed the small distance between them and took his hands in hers, flour still faintly dusting her fingers, and held his gaze steadily. "I am not leaving," she said, with the same quiet certainty she had shown him the night the shop's back door had rattled under a stranger's pressure. "Not because I do not understand the danger, Dorian. I understand it completely. But I have spent my whole life being careful, being small, keeping myself safe, by never wanting anything too much. I do not want to live that way anymore. I want this. I want you. And I want Lily. And whatever risk comes with that, I would rather face it standing beside you than live safely without either of you." Dorian felt something inside his chest give way entirely at her words, some final resistance he had been holding on to out of fear rather than genuine doubt, and he pulled her into his arms without another word, holding her tightly enough that she laughed softly against his shoulder, the sound easing some of the heaviness that had settled over him since the previous night. "If we are doing this," he said quietly, his voice rough, "then we are doing it properly. No more hiding, no more distance. I want Edward Voss and every other man like him to understand exactly what he threatens when he threatens either of you, and exactly what will happen if he pursues it any further." The following days brought a visible shift in how openly Dorian moved through both his worlds. He no longer treated his visits to the bakery as private, careful moments separate from the rest of his life. He brought Noemi into his home for dinner, introduced her formally to the small circle of people closest to him, allowed his organization to see plainly that she and Lily both stood firmly under his protection, a message delivered as clearly to his enemies as any confrontation could have managed. Edward Voss, predictably, did not retreat quietly. The attack came nearly 2 weeks later, not at the bakery this time, but during a rare afternoon Dorian had arranged for the three of them together, a simple outing to a small park not far from the shop, meant to give Lily an ordinary, uncomplicated afternoon, away from the tension that had settled over recent weeks. Victor had insisted on additional security for the outing, a precaution Dorian had agreed to without argument, and it was that same caution that likely prevented the afternoon from becoming something far worse. Noemi noticed the unfamiliar car first, parked just beyond the park's edge, its presence wrong in a way she could not immediately name, but felt clearly in the sudden tightening of her stomach. She caught Dorian's eye across the small distance between them, and something passed silently between them, a shared understanding that the peaceful afternoon had just become something else entirely. "Get Lily," Dorian said quietly, his voice calm but urgent, already moving toward his daughter. What happened next unfolded quickly, the careful, coordinated movement of Dorian's people, responding to a threat that had been anticipated, watched for, prepared against, exactly because Dorian had refused to let his guard down again after the first warning. Voices raised sharply near the park's edge, the unfamiliar car attempting a hurried retreat, Victor's men closing in before it could gain any real distance. And through it all, Noemi's only thought was Lily, small and frightened, pressed tightly against her side, as she pulled the girl behind the solid trunk of a nearby tree. It was over faster than Noemi's racing heart could fully register, the danger contained and driven off before it ever reached them directly. but the fear of those brief, chaotic minutes lingered long after the park had gone quiet again. Dorian reached them moments later, his face pale with an urgency Noemi had never seen in him before, and dropped to his knees in front of Lily, checking her over with trembling hands despite her being entirely unharmed. "I am fine, Dad," Lily said, her small voice steady despite the fright still visible in her wide eyes. "Noemi kept me safe." Dorian looked up at Noemi then, still crouched in front of his daughter, and the expression on his face carried a weight far beyond simple gratitude, something closer to awe, and beneath it, a fierce, protective devotion that had clearly crystallized completely in those few terrifying minutes. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. That evening, once Lily had finally settled into an exhausted sleep, worn out from the fright and excitement of the day, Dorian and Noemi sat together in the quiet of his study, the events of the afternoon still hanging heavily between them. Dorian poured them both a drink neither of them touched, his hands not quite steady, and finally spoke the thought that had been building in him since the moment he saw Noemi shielding his daughter without a second's hesitation. "I cannot keep you safe by keeping you at a careful distance," he said. "I tried that. I told myself I was protecting you by not letting this become more than it already was, and today proved exactly how foolish that thinking has been. The only way to truly protect you and Lily both is to bring you completely into my life, fully, without hesitation, so that no one, not Edward Voss, not anyone else, ever mistakes for a moment how much you both matter to me." Noemi listened quietly, her hands wrapped around the untouched glass in front of her, before she finally looked up and met his eyes directly. "Then stop hesitating," she said simply. Dorian studied her for a long moment, the weight of the day still heavy in the room around them, before something in his expression finally settled, resolved, certain in a way it had not been since long before this entire journey began. "I do not intend to," he said quietly, and though neither of them spoke the full shape of what those words meant that night, both understood clearly that whatever came next, they would face it together, fully, without any of the careful distance that had once kept them apart. The dining room had never been used for anything so ordinary as a simple thank-you dinner, and Grace, who had managed the household for over a decade, seemed almost bewildered by the request when Dorian asked her to prepare something warm and unpretentious, rather than the formal arrangements usually reserved for guests of his standing. He wanted nothing grand. He wanted the kind of evening that might have happened in any ordinary home, and he found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, nervous about how the evening would unfold. Noemi arrived at exactly the time she had been asked, dressed simply, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, looking faintly uncertain as she stepped into the large entrance hall of Dorian's home for the first time, as an invited guest, rather than someone collecting or delivering his daughter. Lily met her at the door with an enthusiasm that immediately eased some of the stiffness from the evening, pulling her by the hand toward the dining room, chattering the entire way about the menu she had helped plan herself. "We are having your favorite," Lily announced proudly, seating Noemi at the table with great ceremony. "I told Dad you liked the bread with the seeds in it, so Grace made some specially." "That was very thoughtful of you," Noemi said, smiling at the girl's evident pride, and glancing briefly at Dorian, who stood at the head of the table watching the two of them with an expression he did not fully bother to hide, something warm and unguarded that had become increasingly common whenever the three of them were together. The dinner unfolded easily, far more easily than Dorian had expected given the formality of the setting, filled with Lily's cheerful chatter, occasional laughter, the comfortable rhythm that had grown naturally between the three of them over these past months. Dorian found himself relaxing more fully than he had in years, watching Noemi charm even Grace, who had approached the evening with the careful professional distance she reserved for guests she did not yet know how to categorize, and who by the meal's end was laughing openly at one of Noemi's stories about a particularly disastrous batch of bread early in her career. It was during the quiet lull after the main course, while Grace cleared plates and Lily kicked her feet idly beneath the table, that the girl spoke the words that would change the entire shape of the evening. "Dad," she said, with the plain, direct honesty only a child possesses, "you should marry Noemi." The table went instantly silent. Grace paused halfway through lifting a plate, glancing quickly between the three of them, before continuing her work with pointed discretion. Dorian felt his own breath catch somewhere in his chest, and across the table, Noemi's face had gone faintly pink, her fork frozen halfway to her plate. "Lily," Dorian said carefully, though his voice lacked any real reprimand. "What?" Lily said, entirely unbothered by the sudden tension her words had created. "You like her. She likes us. Mom is not here anymore, and I do not think she would want you to be alone forever. Noemi makes you happy. She makes me happy too. I do not understand why that is complicated." The simplicity of the child's logic sat heavily in the room, cutting through every careful, adult hesitation that had kept both Dorian and Noemi from naming clearly what had been growing steadily between them for months. Dorian glanced across the table at Noemi, who was watching him with an expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and something far more vulnerable, something that mirrored exactly what he felt building in his own chest. "I think," Noemi said finally, breaking the silence with a small, uncertain laugh, "that we should let the adults finish their conversation another time, Lily." "Why?" Lily pressed, though a little more gently now, as though she sensed she had stumbled onto something delicate. "Do you not want to marry my dad?" Noemi's cheeks flushed further, and she glanced helplessly at Dorian, who found, to his own surprise, that he had no interest in rescuing the moment by deflecting it entirely. Instead, he found himself watching Noemi carefully, curious, despite the awkwardness of the setting, genuinely wanting to hear how she would answer his daughter's blunt, unguarded question. "That is not really something we discuss over dinner," Noemi said carefully, though her voice carried a warmth that suggested the question had not been entirely unwelcome, only unexpected in its timing and directness. Lily seemed to accept this, at least for the moment, returning her attention to the small dessert Grace had just placed in front of her, though the words she had spoken lingered heavily over the remainder of the evening, coloring every glance exchanged between the two adults with new and unspoken weight. After dinner, once Lily had been settled upstairs for the night, exhausted from the excitement of the evening, Dorian walked Noemi out to where her car waited in the drive, the night air cool and quiet around them. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the earlier conversation still hanging unresolved between them. "I am sorry about that," Dorian said finally, though he did not sound entirely sorry, more thoughtful than apologetic. "She says exactly what she thinks. She always has." "You do not need to apologize," Noemi said, wrapping her arms loosely around herself against the chill. "She is not wrong about very much, in my experience." Dorian looked at her carefully, weighing the words, the careful opening she had just offered him, without quite closing the door on it entirely. "Is she wrong about this?" he asked quietly. Noemi was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same seriousness she brought to everything, before she finally spoke. "I do not think she is," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "I have thought about it, more than I probably should this early. I think about what it would mean to be part of this family properly, not just as someone who bakes bread with your daughter on weekends, but as someone who belongs here fully. I think about it more often than I am entirely comfortable admitting." "And what do you feel when you think about it?" Dorian asked, stepping slightly closer, his voice low. "I feel frightened," Noemi admitted honestly, "because I have never wanted anything this much before, and wanting something this much means I have a great deal to lose if it does not work the way I hope it will." Dorian reached out and took her hand gently, the same steady, deliberate gesture she had offered him the very first day they properly spoke, weeks ago in the quiet corner of her shop. "I understand that fear better than you might think," he said. "I lost someone I loved very deeply, and for a long time, I told myself I would never allow myself to feel this way again, because the risk of losing it felt greater than any happiness it might bring. But watching you with Lily, watching the two of you together over these past months, I have come to believe that some things are worth the risk, no matter how frightening they are." Noemi looked up at him, her eyes bright in the soft light spilling from the house behind them, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, the weight of everything unsaid settling comfortably, finally, into the quiet space between them. "I am not asking you anything tonight," Dorian said finally, a small, unfamiliar smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I do not think either of us is quite ready for that yet, and I do not want to rush something this important, simply because my daughter has decided to speak her mind at dinner. Noemi laughed softly, the sound easing the last of the tension from her shoulders. "That is probably wise," she agreed. "But I want you to know," he continued, his voice growing more serious again, "that she was not wrong about how I feel. I have known for some time now that what has grown between us is not something I intend to walk away from. I only needed the courage to say it plainly, and I think, tonight, my daughter gave me exactly that courage." Noemi reached up and rested her hand gently against his cheek, the gesture simple and warm, and entirely without pretense, exactly like everything else about her that had drawn him in from that very first morning outside her shop. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "we should both start being a little braver, rather than waiting for a 7-year-old to say the things we are too careful to say ourselves." Dorian smiled fully then, an expression rare enough that it transformed his entire face, and pulled her gently into an embrace that lasted far longer than either of them had originally intended, standing together in the quiet drive beneath a sky full of stars, both finally allowing themselves to feel, without hesitation, exactly what had been building steadily between them since the very first ordinary, extraordinary morning they met. Neither of them yet knew how soon their courage would be tested again, nor how completely the events of the following weeks would strip away every remaining careful distance between them. But standing there that night, wrapped in the quiet certainty of a feeling too large to keep hidden any longer, both of them felt, for the first time, entirely unafraid of what came next. The school hall was packed with parents when the trouble started. Rows of folding chairs filled with families waiting for the spring recital to begin, the air warm with the noise of children's excited chatter, and the shuffle of programs being read and reread. Dorian sat near the front with Noemi beside him, Victor stationed quietly near the rear entrance, a precaution that had become routine over recent months, rather than anything either of them expected to matter that evening. Lily stood near the side of the stage with her class, dressed in the simple costume she had spent a week perfecting with Noemi's help, practicing her small part in the performance, with the fierce concentration only a 7-year-old can bring to something that matters enormously to her, and almost no one else. She had waved excitedly to both of them from across the crowded hall before disappearing backstage, and Dorian had felt, watching her go, a swell of ordinary, uncomplicated happiness that had become increasingly familiar over these past months. The first sign that something was wrong came from Victor, whose posture shifted almost imperceptibly near the back doors, his attention sharpening on something beyond the hall that Dorian could not yet see. A moment later, his phone buzzed once against his leg, a single message from Victor that made his blood run cold even before he had finished reading it. Unfamiliar vehicles outside, 2 men approaching the side entrance near the stage. Get Lily now. Dorian was on his feet instantly, his hand finding Noemi's arm, his voice low and urgent as he leaned close to explain, keeping his tone level enough not to trigger panic among the families surrounding them. "Something is wrong," he said quietly. "I need you to help me reach Lily, quickly and quietly, without alarming everyone around us." Noemi did not hesitate, rising immediately beside him, her earlier ease dissolving instantly into sharp, focused alertness. Years of watching Dorian's careful vigilance around danger, having taught her exactly how seriously to take a moment like this. Together they moved quickly toward the side of the stage, weaving between rows of chairs, Dorian's eyes scanning constantly for any further sign of the threat Victor had warned him about. They reached the narrow hallway leading backstage, just as the first raised voices erupted somewhere near the side entrance, sharp and urgent, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps and a door slamming forcefully. Dorian's instincts, honed over years of exactly this kind of danger, took over completely, his focus narrowing entirely onto the single task of reaching his daughter before whatever threat had arrived could reach her first. They found Lily just inside the backstage area, still in her costume, her small face confused, and beginning to show the first edges of fear as the commotion outside grew louder. The moment she saw them, she ran straight toward Dorian, but before he could gather her fully into his arms, the narrow hallway behind them filled suddenly with movement. One of Edward Voss's men, pushing past a startled teacher, his focus fixed directly on Lily, with an intent that needed no further explanation. What happened next occurred in the space of only a few desperate seconds, though it would remain etched permanently in all 3 of their memories for the rest of their lives. Dorian moved to place himself between the threat and his daughter, but the narrow hallway and the sudden chaos of fleeing children and parents made clear movement nearly impossible, and it was Noemi, without a single moment's hesitation, who threw herself forward, gathering Lily fully into her arms and turning her own body to shield the girl completely as the brief, frightening struggle erupted around them. It ended almost as quickly as it began, Victor and his men arriving within seconds, the intruder subdued and removed before he could do any real harm. The entire hallway suddenly flooded with security, and the frightened voices of parents and teachers trying to understand what had just happened. But in those brief, chaotic seconds, Noemi had taken the worst of it. A hard fall against the narrow doorframe as she twisted to protect Lily completely, leaving her dazed and struggling to catch her breath on the floor of the backstage hallway. "Noemi," Dorian said, his voice cracking with a fear more raw than anything he had felt even in the worst moments of his dangerous career. Dropping to his knees beside her immediately, Lily still clutched tightly and safely in her arms. "I am all right," Noemi managed, though her voice was thin and unsteady, her hand pressed instinctively against her side where the fall had landed hardest. "Just knocked the breath out of me. Lily, are you hurt, sweetheart?" "I am okay," Lily said, though tears had begun streaming freely down her face, her small hands gripping Noemi's shirt tightly. "You protected me. You just protected me." The ambulance arrived within minutes, summoned immediately despite Noemi's protests that she did not need it, and Dorian rode alongside her the entire way to the hospital, refusing to leave her side for even a moment. Lily held close against him in the back of the vehicle, still trembling from the fright of the evening. The examination that followed revealed bruising and a mild concussion from the fall, serious enough to require careful monitoring, but nothing that would leave lasting harm, a fact that did little to ease the fear that had gripped Dorian completely since the moment he saw her fall. He sat beside her hospital bed long after the doctors had finished their examination, Lily finally asleep in a chair nearby, exhausted from the evening's terror, and watched Noemi rest against the pillows, her face pale but her eyes open, watching him with the same steady, unguarded warmth she had shown him from their very first conversation. "You do not have to sit here all night," she said softly, though her hand found his without hesitation, holding tight. "I am not going anywhere," Dorian said, his voice rough with an exhaustion that went far deeper than the late hour. "I have spent months telling myself I was protecting you by being careful, by keeping some distance between my world and yours, as though that distance would somehow keep the danger from touching you. Tonight proved exactly how wrong I have been. The danger was never going to stay away simply because I hoped it would. The only thing that distance ever accomplished was keeping me from telling you exactly how much you and Lily both mean to me." Noemi listened quietly, her thumb tracing gently over his hand, saying nothing, waiting for him to continue, sensing correctly that he had more to say than he had allowed himself to voice, even during their quiet conversation weeks earlier in his driveway. "I do not want a nanny for my daughter," Dorian continued, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly moving beneath it. "I do not want a friend who happens to be kind to her, or a helper who fills the gaps I cannot manage on my own. I want a family, Noemi. I want you fully in our lives, not carefully, not cautiously, but completely, in every way that matters. I should have said this weeks ago, and I am only sorry it took tonight, watching you nearly hurt protecting my daughter, to finally give me the courage to say it plainly." Before Noemi could respond, before either of them could fully process the weight of what he had just said, a small, sleepy voice spoke from the chair beside the bed, and both of them turned to find Lily awake, watching them both with wide, tear-stained eyes, still heavy with exhaustion, but clear with sudden, unmistakable purpose. She slid down from the chair and crossed the small hospital room without hesitation, climbing carefully onto the edge of Noemi's bed and reaching for her hand, her small fingers wrapping tightly around it, and looked up at her with an expression far older and more certain than her 7 years should have allowed. "Mom," she said simply, the single word landing in the quiet hospital room with a weight that neither adult present had fully prepared themselves to receive. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it, no longer heavy with uncertainty or careful hesitation, but full instead with something warm and complete, the sound of a truth finally spoken plainly, that both adults had been circling carefully for months. Noemi's eyes filled instantly with tears, her hand tightening around Lily's, and she looked up at Dorian, who was watching them both with an expression of open, unguarded wonder, every last piece of careful distance he had ever maintained finally, completely gone. "Is that all right?" Lily asked softly, suddenly uncertain, glancing between the two adults. "Can I call you that?" Noemi pulled the girl gently into her arms, careful of her own bruised side, holding her close and pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head, her voice thick with emotion when she finally managed to speak. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "That is more than all right. That is exactly what I want to be." Dorian watched the two of them together, his daughter held safely and completely in the arms of the woman who had, over the course of one ordinary morning and many months since, become as essential to their small family as either of them could have possibly imagined. He reached into his coat pocket then, his fingers closing around a small object he had been carrying for nearly 2 weeks, uncertain of the right moment, waiting, without fully admitting it to himself, for exactly this kind of clarity. He knelt beside the hospital bed, taking Noemi's free hand gently in his own, and opened his palm to reveal a simple, elegant ring, entirely without the grand theatrics his world might have expected from a man of his standing, offered instead in the quiet, unremarkable setting of a hospital room, exactly the kind of ordinary, honest moment that had defined everything real and good between them from the very beginning. "I was going to wait for a better moment," he said, his voice unsteady with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "But I do not think there will ever be a moment more honest than this one. Marry me, Noemi. Not because Lily asked you to, months ago, though she was wiser than either of us in seeing this, long before we allowed ourselves to. Marry me because I love you, completely and without reservation, and because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life, or Lily's, without you standing fully beside us." Noemi looked down at him, tears falling freely now, her daughter held close against her side, and did not hesitate for even a moment before answering. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with the fullness of everything she felt. "Yes, completely, without any hesitation at all." Lily let out a small, delighted sound, half laugh and half sob, throwing her arms around both of them at once, and for a long moment the small hospital room held nothing but quiet, overwhelming joy. 3 people who had found their way to each other through fear and danger and ordinary kindness, finally, completely, home. Months later, on a warm afternoon filled with sunlight and the smell of fresh bread carried over from the small shop with the faded green sign, Dorian Vane stood beside Noemi as she became, officially and completely, his wife, while Lily stood between them in a simple yellow dress, holding both their hands tightly, beaming with the particular pride of a child who had known, long before either adult had found the courage to admit it, exactly where their story was always meant to lead.